Thank you, everybody, and a big welcome today to our first session of 2026. And I'm delighted to introduce Tom Stedall, who is a stalwart of the Institute. He's really contributed a huge amount to us over the years, and I'm delighted that he's going to give us a talk today, um, called "Into the Ground." And I'm very interested in this subject area. It's very dear to my heart. I'm also very keen on the fact that Tom describes himself as an independent researcher whose fundamental and connecting interest is the nature of consciousness. Um, and I feel that this is a huge and important area for us to develop and think about as systems thinkers, because this is all fundamentally what we're trying to establish is very much how people perceive the world, and see it, and react and connect into it. So, without more ado, I will hand over to Tom and say thank you to him, and let him introduce himself further. I hope. Thank you, Tom.
Great. Thank you, Ian. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you everyone for coming. So it's good for sound levels. Great.
Good. Yeah.
And yeah, so thank you all for coming. And yeah, as I said, yeah, thank you to Ian and the Schumacher Institute for facilitating this. It's really great to be here. I'm going to talk about my recent book, Into the Ground. This started as I started working on this in 2020. It was a bit of a lockdown project, I guess. Um, the ideas seem to come flooding in. Um, it um, it ended up I ended up working on it for about 5 years. So 5 years, a couple of major revisions, and 100,000 words later, it came to its present form, the present text. So it was it was yeah, certainly a bit more than I intended as a project. Um, I At the moment it's not published. The text is available on request, but it's I do very much hope to publish it. And also this is the first time I've spoken on it. I'm really keen to engage with the ideas in this text. I'd really welcome engagement and feedback on them. And and also on this presentation, because as I said, this is the first time I've presented these ideas, and it is a sizable and dense work, and I wouldn't. This is not an entirely light-hearted presentation, I suppose. So I thought I would. I thought I'd start with some ruins. You can hopefully, yeah, you've got my screen share. And I liked the ruins on the Prepare for Change site, Ian, and it sort of inspired me to look for some ruins. And this is the Oracle at Delphi. You may have been. And I think ruins are an interesting image at a few levels. They're an interesting image at a civilizational level. The majority of civilizations and empires that have ever existed are ruins, and ruins are where we're headed at some level. They're also interesting at a psychological level as an image. I think there's a certain sort of health to the image of ruins there. At that sort of level, there's something that is exposed to the elements being reclaimed by nature, as opposed the contrasting image would be perhaps a locked tower, like like something where we haven't been able to look or are not willing to look. There's a in sort of imagistically, I think there's a sense of freedom of walking amongst the ruins. um, structures that have begun to fall away, I suppose. So yeah, leave these. I will leave this image with you as I talk further. Um, so just so let's talk first about a couple of my motivations in writing this book and presenting the ideas. So firstly, science, spirituality, and sustainability. I would say I've had a significant and quite privileged exposure to scientific and spiritual thought, and I've always been very interested in the interface between them. And I should emphasize with this that I think often the interface between them is a subtle or not so subtle um, deferment of one of them to the other. And by the interface between them, I mean something beyond that. I mean, what what does it look like if we take them both seriously on their own terms? And honestly, I don't think we can know what that looks like in the present state of human thought. And that's something that motivates me. And sustainability has become a bit of a buzzword, I am aware, but I do mean something serious by it. In the possibility that life on Earth may continue, um, and that obviously has an interesting and complex interface with science and spirituality. I need any one, and then also all three of them have an interesting and complex interface. And I mean, any one of these interfaces could easily be a talk in itself. And this probably goes for most of my points. I mean, everything I'm talking about, there's um, vastly more to say, but I'm also trying to tread reasonably lightly over it's quite extensive um, set of ideas, but I hope sort of captures some of the depth of it as well. And so a further motivation is the nature of consciousness. This is a fundamental interest of mine, and I think and a significant area of my work. I work as a consciousness researcher. I think I mean, as Ian was saying when he introduced me, consciousness is a connecting interest to me. And I think what's interesting to me about consciousness work is, I mean, is that everything is relevant. I mean, everything that happens in the world, every piece of art, every inner process we experience, every relational process we experience, are of interest from the point of view of understanding consciousness. Right? Yeah. So I'm also motivated by um, questions of duality and non-duality in the Western tradition. I think there's a, um, I think that, and I explore this in my book, but I think that the Western tradition is significantly characterized by duality. And then and I will say more about this over the course of the slides. And then I'm also interested in how we might locate a non-dual position in the Western tradition. And by this, with this, I'm referring to the collapse of duality, but also to non-duality in the sense that is so apparent in the Eastern traditions. Um, so I'm referring to something somewhat different, but by duality and non-duality in the Western Western tradition, beyond one being the negation of the other. Maybe so, yeah, but they are deeply related endeavors. Um, and last but not least, I mean the crisis of our time, and I think for in the in terms of the work of the Schumacher Institute, the work of those involved in the Schumacher Institute. I mean, this, um, I know I've no doubt that you are acutely aware of this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, or any time stating it. I mean, it really is given. I mean, I started writing this in 2020, which was felt like a moment of profound crisis. I mean, was a moment of profound crisis, and that sense really has only increased. And I feel like this year we're now going into um, is an extremely um, significant and challenging moment. And I'm sure many of you share that feeling. And I mean, I've seen it described as a polycrisis. I think it's important to sort of appreciate the multifacetedness of the crisis. I mean, it's ecological, social, political, cultural, psychological. Um, as I said, I think this is something we're all, yeah, all quite acutely aware of. So with these motivations, um, this is the, excuse me, just moving the Zoom thing so I can read my notes. And so with these motivations, this is the sort of shape of my book, by way of a bit of introduction. So it's into the ground. Into the ground is referring to a few things. It's referring to the ground of being and the search for the ground of being. What is the deepest ground of being? What is the deepest nature of reality and consciousness? This is a question that humans have always sought. Um, it's an image of return to the earth. So that's an image of return to that which sustains us, but and it's also an image of death. And it's an image of collapse and regeneration. And I think particularly about phrases like ploughing into the ground. It's an interesting phrase. Like ploughing into the ground is an image of sort of terminal collapse, but it's also an image of um, latent regeneration. Um, and there's the image of the compost heap as well. Ian was reminding me, but it's an interesting image. Weird and wonderful things grow out of a compost heap. And the compost heap is this isn't my phrase, but it's an allusion to various postmodern forms. So postmodernism and post-structuralism and this sort of seeming disintegration, and what might grow out of that. The book has a sort of twofold structure. There's 9 chapters sort of written around like broadly themed areas. So the first half, sort of opening chapter signatures, non-duality, evolution, and metaphysics, is the construction of a philosophical position, which I will talk a little bit about. Um, and then the second half of the book is a more science, ecology, power, and consciousness is a more deconstructive arc, that's taking a more critical and reflexive view of how and what we know. Um, the and the middle, the central chapter is knowledge, which is an exploration of the nature of knowledge itself. And this, in a way, is the pivot of these two halves, because with a reflexive position on knowledge, we can attempt a more reflexive discourse. And I mean, this is what really fundamentally characterizes the postmodern. Um, so there's an element of deliberate element of construction and deconstruction, and the chapter on science is a sort of deconstructive recapitulation of the chapter on metaphysics, ecology, recapitulates the chapter on evolution. Power recapitulates the chapter on non-duality. Um, and finally, the final chapter, consciousness, recapitulates the opening chapter. So if you engage with the text, I hope that might be a sort of bit of a helpful guidance as to um, my intentions with the text. And there are, I've referred to many books drawn on many wonderful books in writing this, like more than I will mention sort of some as I go, but I mean more than I can do justice to here. But there are a series of key historical texts that I wanted to mention to give a bit of context for the historical positions or the historiographies that I'm coming at these ideas with. And you all of these you could say in some way are sort of they're quite epic historical accounts. They're sweeping historical accounts. They cover significant portions of human history with I would say significant insight. And Robert Bella's Religion in Human Evolution is probably the single book that um, without which um, I would not have been able to structure the ideas in their present form. It's absolutely fundamental, really, to everything I'm saying. It's a remarkable work of scholarship. Um, it's about it's an account in the field of the sociology of religion about the development of religion in human culture. It focuses on the axial age, which is a remarkable period in the mid to late first millennium BCE, which sees remarkable but also remarkably contemporary developments in ancient Greece, ancient Israel, India and China, or at least parts of modern India and China. Um, and it explores the characterization of the axial age. And I mean, one of the one of the things that characterizes the so the axial age is arguably the establishment of religion in its modern form. And one of the things that one of the things that sort of characterizes it um, is a more trans the establishment of a more transcendent conception of the divine. Um, but also the possibility of a more personal connection to the divine. So that's a kind of interesting tension. And that personal connection to the divine is again arguably in contrast to earlier religious configuration, where the connection to the divine was mediated by the king, and this is really what characterizes the great Bronze Age civilizations, which were prior to the axial period. And it also argues that the axial period represented the really the advent of theoretical thought, which is something that we kind of almost take for granted. I mean, we don't know how not to do it, um, but this is thinking about thinking or thinking for its own sake, and it's a modality that we see very acutely in the Socratic philosophers. Um, and Bella argues that this modality arose out of earlier modalities in human cultural evolution based on mythic and ritual forms. So there's a huge amount to this work, and it's worth spending a bit of time on because it's so magnificent in its scope. And Richard Tarnas, The Passion of the Western Mind, this is a history of Western ideas from the pre-Socratic philosophers to postmodernism. And it's an interesting account in that it includes the Christian era, whereas many accounts sort of do something of a jump from the classical era to the Renaissance and scientific revolution. And so in a sense, it picks up where Bella leaves off in the Western case. Um, Also by Richard Tarnas, Cosmos and Psyche. This is an account of possible correlations of history to outer planetary cycles. So it's an astrological historiography. Now, astrology is an interesting area. It's it's very important to many. It's also dismissed out of hand by many. I'm very interested in it, but this talk, I'm not really emphasizing it in this presentation. But if you have an interest in this dimension of things, there's absolutely an astrological subtext to much of what I'm saying. Um, the Master and His Emissary, uh, by McGilchrist, who's is a who's just out of interest, who's familiar? Is anyone familiar with this book? Yeah, cool. Couple of you. I think this is I think this is arguably one of the most um uh, arguably one of the most sort of important um recent accounts of things. I think it's a hugely important thesis. It is the first part of it is an exploration of the nature of the right and left brain, the functioning of the the difference in functioning of the right and left brain hemispheres at a level of how they do what they do, and that how they do what they do, and that's crucial to the argument. But the second half of it is a survey of Western history covering very similar territory to Tarnas, and exploring that Western history in terms of the changing dominance of right and left brain, changing dominance of the right and left brain at a cultural level. And there's an in, and because McGilchrist and Tarnas cover sort of similar material, it's then there's an interesting question of comparison of the accounts. I mean, um, McGilchrist's account is explicitly dialectical via hemispheric dominance. Um, Tarnas's account is more subtly, I would say, dialectical, but my I would read it as having a Hegelian dialectic. And I do offer a sort of cautious comparison of these two accounts as dialectical accounts of history. And actually, I think there's an echo of it in Graeber's account as well. So Graeber debt the first 5,000 years. I think this is a book that's likely to be familiar. It's a fantastically rich history of economic exchange over the whole record of human history. I mean, the earliest surviving writing in the Near East refers to the use of debt. So it is as I mean, it's older than the written record. Um, and yeah, and this book is global in its scope. It refers to the Christian and Christian and Islamic worlds, also to Indian and Chinese. So in terms of Bella's global treatment of the axial age, Graeber's book is sort of similar scope. Um, and finally, then Richard Seaford, Money in the Early Greek Mind, is so this is referred to by both Bella and by Graeber, and it's a very interesting book that I was really delighted to find. And it's a thesis the that pre that the advent of pre-Socratic philosophy in the early Greek city-states reflected monetization in that context. And I will say more about it in a subsequent slide, but it's a very interesting argument. I should say that Seaford has a very specific definition of money, and it's part of his thesis that this monetization reflected something that was a difference of kind to the economic exchange in other Near Eastern contexts. At the same time, Graeber is arguing that debt is as old as history, and certainly I don't see the accounts as at odds. But they they're both very interesting, and from a point of economic history. But this Seaford's book is a really fascinating thesis. So with this kind of quite dense historical background, I um, this is another dense. This is another quite um, well. I hope not too dense, but um, this is um, this is an effort to sort of outline the philosophical position that I come up with in the first half of the book, and then also including the discussion of knowledge. I can't. I mean, I can't possibly um, cover it all. So I'm hoping just to sort of capture some of the things that are motivating me with it, and then if I hope it's of interest. So I start with a the observation of experience and relationship and meaning as fundamental to human experience. And I think this is, I hope, this is something that life, living things, in human culture in its long existence could at some level agree on. That these things are these things are these things are fundamental. I think in the modern in the modern Western worldview, that sort of position is a yeah, it's a more difficult position in the modern Western worldview, and that's telling. But at a level of shared human experience, I mean, of course, these things are fundamental. Um, I look for, and this is a point that's been of great interest to me. I look for signatures of the interplay of. There's a couple of signatures I look for. One is the interplay of creativity and persistence, um, and I make observations around this occurring in the context of physical evolution to an extent, but particularly biological evolution, and then human cultural evolution, based on Bella's perspective and the scholarship that Bella is drawing on for that perspective, which particularly like anthropological scholarship, um, in um, in how in how we conduct ourselves. Sort of, I think there's a it can be, meaningfully this signature can be meaningfully located in a psychological context, um, and also then crucially in an epistemic context, in knowledge generation, and the work of Thomas Kuhn is extremely significant in that sense. The other signature that's of interest to me is evolution and development, or phylogeny and ontogeny, and this is a I need to be careful with this because there are quite simplistic statements of this, and I don't intend a simplistic statement of it. For example, that development just recapitulates evolution. It's not in any way that simple, but the there I use the phrase sort of complex mirroring, but there are um, there's interesting ways in which aspects of development recapitulate aspects of evolution, and this occurs in biological contexts. But then it's also interesting, again, drawing on Bella's work, to infer this in the context of human cultural evolution. Um, Bella, in Bella's framework, he actually draws on the work of Brunner and Piaget in child development to construct his typology of religious experience. So he relates his view of the formation of he relates his view of religion to that of child development, and it's important to say he offers that as a conceptual parallel. I don't want to imply that he is making more of an inference by that than he is. But then at a level of this sort of at a level of this signature of evolution and development, that's very interesting. So I explore that. And the recognition of the sciences. This is, I think, in a lot of scientific discourse, the we don't see the wood for the trees. I think a lot of scientific discourse is focused on the trees, um, whereas the fundamental recognition of the sciences is kind of almost is almost backgrounded, but is the really remarkable thing. And by this I mean the just extraordinary level of patterning in the universe that physics particularly reveals. I mean, if you think that the classical thinkers were so interested in the presence of number in reality, I mean, what we see now is just beyond their wildest dreams. Not just in the extent of that patterning, but also of orders of number and geometry that were had not yet been discovered. Um, so there's certainly, with mathematical physics, there's certainly a Platonic view of it. It's not a particularly fashionable view. I think I'm very open to it. It's a view that Penrose notably takes. And there's a good essay by Wigner from the 70s called "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences," which is a brilliant title. It kind of poses the question, really. Um, and so I emphasize, yeah, this recognition of the sciences, of this patterning in the of this of patterning in the of patterning in reality. Now, reality unfolds in time, but in some sense, this patterning exists out of time, and that's a key observation that I work with. The the consequence of the patterning is in time, but the patterning is has a different character. Um, I also talk about challenges to science, and this is particularly based on modern consciousness research. There are areas that are substantiated by really a vast amount of human experience and also decades of empirical work, but are dismissed or read, easily dismissed in the scientific mainstream. So I mean, based on Radin's work, for example, I'd be think things like, well, the phenomena of telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, near-death experiences. Astrology is also interesting in this. Synchronicity, the phenomena of dreaming, predictive dreaming, and there's a lot to say about this, and I'm aware it's controversial, but I think yeah, certainly in my work as a consciousness researcher, this is what I'm interested in. And I think, although there is skepticism about this, I think that tends to dominate the discourse, whereas actually there's a lot of awareness of this openness to it, interest in it, interesting work in it, which is actually much more prevalent than the skepticism. And so putting this together, I explore the idea of temporality and atemporality. And so I've already alluded to this with the recognition of the sciences, um, but the idea that there is reality unfolding in time, and then there are orders of atemporal patterning. So I this recognition of the sciences that I've offered, I in the position I develop, I generalize this recognition to the possibility of multiple levels of patterning of reality, and also the possibility of the co-evolution of these, um, the co-evolution of the temporal and the atemporal. So that's the sort of shape of the philosophical position I devise. It's a generalization of in the view I offer. It's a generalization of the recognition of the sciences, but also taking that recognition to its most um, the most general statement I can of that recognition, which is a dynamic co-creativity. Um, Obviously, that's inspired by obviously um, Socratic view is a relevant and an informant of such a position. And I see meaning as fundamental, and I suggest that meaning arises at the interface of the temporal and the atemporal. Now, this is obviously at some level, this is all of this is a philosophical position. It's just it's an intellectual construction, but I hope that at some level that's a resonant statement, like meaning at a I feel like there's something right about that meaning has to do with the presence of eternity in the moment and the imprint of the moment on eternity. Um, and importantly, when we then come to these challenges to science, if meaning is acknowledged as fundamental, they're a lot less challenging because all of these things I've referred to are meaningful, including meaningful coincidence, which is what synchronicity is. Um, so while we can sort of get hung up on the sort of statistical establishment of them, the all of these phenomena of consciousness are um, are, are meaningful. So if we have a philosophical position that um, holds meaning, then um, we potentially open open the space of curiosity about reality. Extending this a little into the view of knowledge I develop. I mean, this is a point that I kind of realized as I was writing this, but read I have read it in other places as well. I've seen it said in other places as well. That in a non-dual conception, the ways of knowing that we have are part of that non-duality. They can't be distinct from it. And there's an interesting image of viewing platforms that, like, consciously or not, we operate in the world, from certain perspectives. And one of the interesting things about expanded states of consciousness is that they can seem to collapse those viewing platforms. Those become part of the flux. The ways of knowing are part of the same flux as what we know. Um, I also explore knowledge as relational. Like, a great deal is said in the modern Western tradition about, is our experience real? And it's potentially very sterile territory. But I argue that in a relational view of knowledge, um, this tension is collapsed. It's the only this is the only sentence I'm going to read from what I've written, but what I say about it is the position here leads to two answers to this. One is that we do not know reality in a way that is independent of our experience because this is relational, because the knowing of reality is relational. The other is that we do come to know reality through our experience, again, because this is relational. And so I offer the relational view as collapsing something that a great deal of philosophical effort is spent on. Um, and I also explore the idea of knowledge as metaphorical, and I think this is very important. And this is McGill. This is an insight of McGilchrist, and it's actually the closing comment of Master and his emissary that metaphor is how we come to know the world. I think that reality is much more metaphorical and poetical than our culture um, acknowledges. I think if we think about the sort of overuse of the word literally in modern discourse, um, we need more. We need um, we need more metaphor. The I think the although there's a lot of detail in the argument that I offer, um, it is looking for it is seeking a more poetic and metaphorical view of things, which is absolutely a right brain view in McGilchrist's thesis. Okay, so that's an effort at least to convey the what I'm thinking about in the philosophical position I devise. Um, the final three chapters of what I've written, ecology, power, and consciousness, each form in different ways a reflection on a theory of change, and that's what I want to particularly emphasize in this talk. Um, I mean, certainly, I know in my work over the years and in the work of the Schumacher Institute, I mean, I know, I know this is what we're focused on, like positive change, and how do we bring it about? Um, so I hope these speak to that. Obviously, there are no easy answers. Um, so the first sort of perspective on theories of change that I can offer relates to outer change, like change in the world. And I titled the first point in this worldview and money. And for this, I go back to this is where I go back to Seaford's thesis. And this is why it was so interesting to encounter this thesis of the development of pre-Socratic philosophy representing, reflecting monetization in the early Greek city-states. Now, Seaford's argument is that Seaford's argument about money is very interesting, but he talk. I believe that what what he's identifying in it is um, money as a separation of value in some sense. He uses words like like he uses words like transcendent value, separation of value, sublimated value. That's a very interesting phrase. Sublimated value. That's when something solid becomes something gaseous. Um, and his argument is that the character of pre-Socratic philosophy is informed by this innovation that was occurring in that cultural context of monetization. So then, um, that various tenets of the philosophy of the pre-Socratic philosophers um, have this quality of money. Um, there's a great deal to Seaford's thesis, and I don't I'm cautious about making any oversimplifying remarks about it. I think there's a really there's a lot to what he says and many dimensions to what he says. But this identification was very interesting, and I think is food for thought, because obviously then out of um, pre-Socratic philosophy comes Socratic philosophy, and in a sense the Western tradition. So going from there to now, it's interesting to observe the present situation, and um, I should again sort of qualify that in saying that I don't mean that the development of ideas and the development of money are, continuously historically correlated in the way that I am suggesting. It's an important qualification. I sort of rather see um, the modern situation as a very interesting, as a fascinating, well, the reflection of the modern situation um, in this situation, really at the inception of modern Western culture, um, is is very interesting. I'm at pains to say that I'm highlighting a thought-provoking reflection rather than a sort of continuous historical development. But coming into the present day, the we certainly have this separation of value in our worldview. Um, the Tarnas has an interesting observation that the different sort of periods of Western history are characterized by duality in different ways. So, in the classical era, you have the ideal and the real. In the Christian era, you have heaven and earth. And in the scientific era, you have subject and object. Um, and Plumwood is very, Plumwood, who wrote the ecofeminist text, The Feminism and the Mastery of Nature, talks very interestingly about um, the evolution of dualization and dichotomy in the Western tradition. Um, but that this analysis by Tarnas is a sort of broad brushstrokes of that. And now this is really the kind of I hope this is the core of what I want to convey in a sense. So um, looking at this looking at this kind of shifting duality, these different manifestations of duality in the Western tradition, I was pondering this and then looking at now and it occurred and I realized that I believe we are now living a different form of this, which is the virtual and the real. That's the next chapter. And this is really evident actually in the work of Naomi Klein, her work over several decades, brilliant historical work over several decades. This is something that comes through very strongly in her work. But I mean, it hardly needs stating. I mean, through the internet and subsequent technologies, AI most recently. I mean, globalization, the branding of globalization. We're there is a there is absolutely a virtualization um, present. And I mean, Naomi Klein talks about difficulty that this presents then in terms of working with the the crucial and urgent ecological issues of our time. And at this, so we have so on the one hand, in the Western tradition, we have an evolving duality of an evolving separateness, um, which I would argue in its current form has become the virtual and the real, although all of the previous separatenesses persist and continue to inform the present cultural context. And that's the kind of that's the idea of persistence that I explore. I mean, things don't go away. Things don't. The influence of things doesn't go away. And so take that. Then on the other hand, the financial system, I mean, is just obviously and utterly a completely detached thing. Um, the whole thing is based on the trading of just arbitrarily complex financial instruments that are no longer rooted in reality in any way. It's deeply destructive. It's been described as a vampire squid, but I think a tumor would be more appropriate. So, here we are with a detached worldview with the virtual and a detached financial system, and you know, hence being so fascinated about Seaford's remarks on the situation 2,500 years ago. And I mean, um, arguably the scientific trajectory um, in in the in the world um, in the Western worldview does represent a revaluation of the material of the real, but I think it's a conflicted I think it's a conflicted revaluation. Um, I don't think it. Plumwood talks interestingly about this. It represents something of a reclamation of the real, but I think it's a conflicted reclamation. So what this all of this leads to, this sort of crux of ideas, I mean, what this leads to is a recognition of the divorce of value. And I use that phrase because divorce is a terminal. I've been talking about separation, and I mean, so divorce is a terminal form of separation, right? That we're in some sense in our moment in history is a divorce of um, a divorce of value, and I'm using value there in two senses. There's what we value in terms of the construction of our worldview, and what so this is like value at an ideological level, and what we value in terms of what sustains us, which is what we value at an economic level. So I hope the sort of shape of what I'm trying to say there is clear. Eisenstein's work, I think, is a very much reflects this. His books, which again I'm sure many of you are familiar with, his book Sacred Economics. He talks there about multiple forms of capital, natural, I think like natural, social, cultural, and financial capital. I mean, even the fact we use the term capital is a consequence of this separation, but hopefully we can stop one day. But it's and then he provides a very detailed argument about the necessity for financial capital to be returned to um, to other forms of capital, and his argument for this is very specifically negative interest. And then, in addition to that, he suggests a system whereby value is retained at a level of natural capital rather than financial capital. So that's really an absolutely resonant thesis with what I'm saying, a different statement of it in terms of forms of capital. Big influence. It's a fun, yeah, very rich work. And what I think we can do with all of this is offer what I think all this can lead to is a metric of real change. We are all of us, are, I work in or interested in, positive socio-ecological change. Um, and I think this question of return of value, so this is value at a sort of, as I said, this is value at an ideological and economic level, but this this idea of the return of value, I think, then offers a metric of real change. I mean, it's all too familiar to see change that's well intentioned and maybe like in the right direction, but doesn't actually challenge the structural bases of that which it's seeking to redress. I'm sure we're all familiar with that in different ways. So I think this kind of identification provides um, a metric of real change. Like, does it entail a return of value to the earth of the earth? Um, there's an interesting phrase, truncated reversal, that Plumwood uses in Feminism and the Mastery of Nature. And actually, she uses this in the context of scientific materialism. So, this is the sort of conflicted return that science represents that I was talking about. She argues that scientific materialism, although it's a challenge to Cartesian separation, um, is a is a truncated reversal, that it doesn't fully reverse the valuation. And I think it's a phrase that has wider applicability. Is the return of the return of value to the earth um, real, or yeah, or truncated? So I offer I suppose I offer this as a way to, as a model to think about, to think about real change with, like, what really cuts it? Does it reverse this, you know, um, terminal separation of value from that which really matters, that we find ourselves in? So I hope that's of interest as a perspective on change. Um, the next two are a little briefer, because I do want to leave time for questions. So the second perspective on change is, this is in contrast, is much more focused on inner change. I'm indebted to the work of Alistair McIntosh here, particularly his book Soil and Soul, and he talks about power as prepositionally qualified. Um, so we're familiar with power over, um, but there's power to, for example, or power from. There are different modalities of power in, um, and I identify, what I believe are two forms of power that we all possess, or that are available to everyone, which are and are sources of true power, and identify these as power within and power between. So with power within, I'm referring to the ability. I'm referring to that by sustained inner work, we can change ourselves. That this is inner transformation is real, and power between. I'm referring with power between, which is very much contingent on power within and inner work. I'm referring to the ability to create community. I think it's interesting that community is quite fetishized in the modern West. I mean, really, because the majority of humans who have ever existed have lived in relatively small communities. Um, it's been destroyed in modernity to such a colossal extent. I mean, in a way, we all want to be back there, but I think there is a certain sort of I think it's important to recognize that the challenge of that. I mean, community is community is difficult. Community is not the end; it's the beginning or the new beginning. And it's actually as a kind of quite explicit as a an interesting explicit example of this in I'm aware from many conversations over the years that with progressive land projects, one of the barriers to progressive land projects, probably the first, is the access to and affordability of land, especially in the West, and well, yeah, in the West. And this, of course, relates to the perverse situation around valuation that I was talking about previously, but also the when these projects get underway, one of the big barriers to their continuity um, is people falling out. They don't, they don't last because of the difficulties people have in making them work. I've heard many heard many. This is something I've heard reflected many times. So yeah, community is hard work. It's not the end. It's the beginning. That's what I mean by that. But I think these are forms of power that we all possess. And they're they're modest, but also they're the 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 greatest power we possess. I would offer that. Um, and then power over, in a sense, isn't power. It's a perversion. I mean, again, this is something that Plumwood points out that a relationship based on um, power over, is not a relationship. I mean, power over violence is what is done in in the absence of a real relationship because it isn't a real relationship. So we can, I mentioned this in my abstract, we can then just keep an eye on the time. We can therefore talk about the reclamation of meaning and power in modernity, the reclamation of meaning and power, um, from what I would say from their deprecation in modernity. Um, but these are things that we've always had. This again is a I think maybe one of the reasons why Bella's work is so inspiring because he's talking about human evolution over the entire speciation of the human species. I mean, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. This is the sort of period he's referring to. Um, but again, in the majority of human culture that has ever existed, I mean, true meaning and true power, in the sense as I've indicated, are the fabric of it. It's only really in the modern West that they're such problematic problematic recognitions. So we can identify in this the reclamation of in all of this the reclamation of meaning and power in postmodernity, and I think that's a that's a real and deep and urgent challenge. What will grow out of the compost heap. Um, I'm sure it's not stretching it to say that like that any indigenous culture would recognize the meaning and the power of reality. So finally, the evolution of consciousness in the um, in my interest in consciousness, I'm also interested in the evolution of consciousness. I haven't really had time to talk about it, but this is a. I will just say that I offer the view that the evolution of consciousness lies in the choices that we make, and also with this distinction of temporality and atemporality. Um, that this challenging this challenge of this challenge of being in time, that life is also where this possibility lies, that time is where the freedom is, um, or potentially is. All right, so the final one is the final one is brief. Um, this goes back to the meanings of into the ground that I was alluding to. I'm very much, you know, um, alluding to a death rebirth process. I believe civilizationally we are going through a death rebirth process, whether we like it or not. We're going through a death rebirth process. If you think of the death rebirth process in myth as well, I actually just thought of this as I was putting this together. But what does this involve? It involves the descent into the underworld. You have to go into the ground, and um, then there's the challenge of getting back out. There's a lot of mythical image around that. So this is a yeah, I believe what we find ourselves in is a death rebirth process. And my final comment on change is this: that in true relationship with nature, by choice or by necessity, we will be changed. We will be changed. And I would then offer that these perspectives of inner and outer change that I've offered so far live within that. So that is what I wanted to offer. Um,
Thank you, Tom. That's that's fantastic. Such a huge amount of material there, indeed. You've increased my book list by quite a large number of new books I need to read, but I'm hoping that maybe yours could actually suffice to do that or job for me. So I'm really looking forward to that. If everybody's managed to read that last screen there, Tom, could you just unshare, and then I can see everybody to maybe.
yeah, of course. Yeah, I've just put my contact details up
Yeah,
here, folks. I'll
that's
put
right.
it back up at the end. Yeah, let me stop the sharing. It's yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you, Tom. Um, yes, there's so many different things going out of that, and one of the underlying thoughts I had all the time through that was this is so much fantastic material that helps us to be systems thinkers. Taking on board what you've covered there made me think there's a richness of ideas that we need to sort of embed within ourselves. I picked up very much on one thing I'm always keen on is the concept of metaphor in systems thinking. I also loved a little bit earlier we were talking about the persistence and creativity. And the dynamic between them, I feel, is something that have to recognize in systems that we've got a past dependence of how we come here where we are, and that's persisting. While at the same time we want to shift and we have to create new pathways, and that sort of difference there between persistence and creativity, I think, is so important.
Mm.
Anyway, I'm not going to pursue that because I'm going to open up to everybody else now and say, has anybody got any questions or comments they'd like to add into this? So please fire away. Yeah. Have we any in the chat there? Any thoughts? Anybody? Right, Richard. Richard, yeah.
Yeah, hi, Tom. That was really very, I would say both stimulating and synchronistic in the sense that many things you've been touching on, I'm kind of resonating because they're kind of bobbing around in my reality at the minute. So, yeah, I'd like to dive into your text, if that's at all possible, because I feel I feel there's some digging to be done in that particular ground. But yeah, I mean, there were so many kind of little. I'm sorry, I'm a bit of a kind of, I resonate with words, and so I was picking up on virtual realities, and then thinking, oh, veridical realities, the same VR, but slightly different meaning of VR, in terms of real reality or true reality. And
Mm,
it also made me think about, alchemy traditionally actually was harnessing, as it were, the science and technology of the time in the terms of kind of Newtonian alchemy. And I'm just wondering what the alchemy is that might we might be facing with our current digital environment, which is rapidly evolving in very strange ways and challenging ways, and socioeconomically tsunami changing type ways, which I feel is going to expose a lot of the value issues that you were alluding to, because the basis of money and labor related income is going to be blown out of the water.
mm,
It may not happen next year, but it's certainly not going away, and it's coming pretty fast down the tracks. So, you know, the framework you're offering here, I think, is really valuable in the sense of trying to understand the kind of manifestation of all of these changes and the realization that we've actually got to find some kind of anchor against the tsunami, or where there are these rather more eternal truths to be recognized. So that's my burble. I've got no question, but I'll be interested in your comments, the thoughts.
no, no. Thank you, Richard. And it's a great comment, question, and great to see you here. Um, it's I think it's very important what you're saying. I mean, there's different aspects to it. Um I think in art, this recognition of the virtual is or the virtualization. I mean, is just a matter of doing. I mean, not just a matter of doing it, but it's a significant step to recognize it. I mean, I work in these worlds, but I mean, when this observation that the whole course of Western history has had sort of one form of potentially problematic duality or another at work in it, and to recognize that. And I think if we can recognize that, then we can learn to work with it more, like work with it better. It's not all bad. I mean, the internet, AI, they're like they're on the one hand, they're brilliant tools. On the other hand, they are, just immersive realities that people lose themselves in to the detriment of their mental health, which is something we're just seeing on an epic scale now. So, and there's an interesting parallel then to McGilchrist's thesis that the right relationship in his view of the master and the emissary is that the emissary so the emissary is the master is the right brain and the emissary is the left brain, and it's based on the metaphor is based on a story by Nietzsche, that um oh yeah, sounds like there's a bit of feedback from someone on, yeah. Um, yeah, it's based on a story by Nietzsche, that there was a master who was the ruler of a kingdom, and he had an emissary to do his bidding and sort of do the work of ruling for him. And the emissary was meant to report back to the master. But eventually, the emissary realized that he could just rule and cut the master out. Um, so that's a prescient story by Nietzsche. I mean, especially given that like Nietzsche has really interesting work on the Apollonian and Dionysian in classical thought, which are images of the images of this as well. Um, but the so McGilchrist's argument, therefore, is that the right relationship between the hemispheres has been lost. That the rather than the right relationship is that, as he sees it, is that the right brain is the relational, is the source of creativity, that this is passed to the left brain for processing and then passed back. I mean, it's it's like, it might be stretching it a bit, but it's kind of what we do with our computers. You know, we have a great idea and then we put it into practice. Whereas he's arguing that the left, that the modality of the left brain has come to dominate, and that's the flatness of our culture, which is why I think it's such an important and I mean, McGilchrist doesn't mince his words. He sees our cultural situation as a sort as a terminal one. So it's so, and that's why I think this is such an important book in the cultural recognition he contains. But maybe that speaks to what you're saying, that I think if we can recognize this, that's a step towards that's a step towards um, working with it, and we and yeah, and then and we need to. I mean, there's an there's another there's a lot in it. I mean, I think this, especially this thing of sort of immersive forms, you know, just like forms we get lost in, to like the detriment to the detriment of things that really matter. Um, yeah, there's more I could say, but if
Yeah.
make time for
Yeah,
questions. Yeah.
thanks, Tom. Anybody else got a comments there? Um, I'd like to maybe follow on a little bit from that in terms of the embodiment of thinking, how important you consider that in your work, and also related to that is the development of consciousness, and language. How is that actually paralleled in many ways? So those are thoughts to me that, when we talk about virtuality, that we're and the virtualness of what we deal with now, that is all very much disembodied. Um, but our conscious evolution has been only because we are embodied. It is being embodied in a biological system. So does that come through to you? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question and observation, Ian. And yeah, absolutely, it does. I haven't particularly emphasized this aspect of what I've worked what in my presentation, but the sort of the comment of meaning and experience and relationship as fundamental, and I dig into that in the book. I mean, it's absolutely of an embodied perspective, and I something I make note of, is a is an incipient somatic perspective in modernity. So I mean, you have the Cartesian separation of the thinking I, and I mean, this is a separation, from the body, from animals, as in, you know, humans have it, animals don't. But what that meant in I mean, subsequent colonial exploitation was that the white men had it. I mean, there's a very problematic political aspect to this dualization. Plumwood is brilliant on this, but I do identify something I would I do identify something. Okay, I, I'm not. I wasn't entirely sure how to capture it, but a sort of incipient somatic perspective in modern culture. I mean, if you think about all of the sort of you know I mean, psychoanalysis and depth psychology is a very important development in really at the sort of um, beginning of postmodernity, arguably, and I think that's very significant. There's a lot to that, but I mean, if you think about sort of broadly kind of therapeutic work now, or I mean the work on trauma of the work of Gabor Mate, Van der Kolk, there are there are there's so much work now, progressive progressive work for kind of positive inner change that n n not just emphasizes the somatic, but I mean it would be meaningless to describe that work in in any other way. Like it's a I think I think the legacy of Cartesian separation is with us, but at the same time, there are really significant cultural efforts to recover an embodied view, and it's real, and it's real at a level of this is how people are able to
Right.
find healing in their lives. So I think so. Absolutely, the embodied perspective comes through. There's also an aspect of it that I wanted to that I didn't really I wasn't sort of really able to incorporate into the presentation, but I relate some of the ideas that I'm talking about to uh I relate the kind of main philosophical thrust to um the Eastern recognitions, the Buddhist recognitions of form and emptiness, and something I come to, which is a thread throughout, is the co-substantiality of thinker and thought. And I mean, this I think is kind of evidently sort of draws. This is evidently sort of informed by Eastern perspectives, but that our thought processes are part of the. I don't. There's no way in which I see mind and body as separate things. Like our thought processes are part of the somatic gestalt. And this is interestingly, this is really how it's seen in the Eastern traditions. The mind-body duality is very pronounced in the West with Descartes, but in the Eastern traditions, mind and body are variously much more seen as co-substantial. Whereas the thing that is other is when the thing that is not other is ultimate consciousness. So there's quite a different inflection in the Eastern tradition, and I think this kind of this idea of co-substantiality of thinker and thought is really important. I mean, it says absolutely is recovering the somatic. I also wanted to say just really briefly a point on the creativity, the interplay of creativity and persistence in systems thinking. This was very much on my mind when I was writing this. I mean, that's what got my attention. I mean, it seems to me like a systems property that's evident at multiple levels of reality. And then you have the fascinating question of like, well, what's the system? Because creativity and persistence in biology is operating in an apparently different context to creativity and persistence in human cultural evolution or knowledge production. So that then opens the question of what's the system. But absolutely, I see that
Yeah.
as a systems property, and that's really how it got my attention. So yeah, I hope that helps.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I'm quite fascinated by that tension between that what might call the static nature of systems and the dynamic nature as well. And it's not a case of either or. It's just that they're working together all the time. If we didn't have the staticness, then the dynamic would just explode into, say, chaotic situations. But if you didn't have the sort of that dynamic, static would just disappear. It would just not move. Nothing would happen. And that's that tension all the time that I think we need to explore in systems. And we can sort of see that with the sort of way increasingly our big systems have become more and more static, and we can't shift them. And we're all madly dashing around trying to push them a little bit here and there, but the dynamism has disappeared, and they go stale and they decay. Yeah. So it's a fascinating uh, talk. Has anybody got any more comments at this point? Because I've got one question for you, Tom, that I'm not sure whether you'll like it or not. When can we read your book? Yeah, and
Wow.
where can we get it?
Yeah, so let me put up my let me put up my contact details again.
Yeah,
So that has my email address. So the book's got a website, intotheground.net. This is very rudimentary at present. And at the moment I've got the text available on request. I'm kind of considering at this point my options in terms of publication. But it is absolutely available on request. So please do email me. I'll put the slide back up. Yeah, yeah. Let me do that now.
right.
Um,
Well, I'll copy that down and publish it on our website as well for people to access.
Great, thank you. Yeah, let me just
Yeah,
great.
yeah,
Can everyone see that? So yeah, that's so
that's it. Yeah,
intotheground.net
good.
is the beginnings of a website. Actually, under these skies is my Substack. That's actually mostly focused on my is focused on my consciousness work, my and particularly my astrological work. So if you're interested in that aspect of things, that's my Substack. And yeah, my email is there, tom.s at schumacherinstitute.org.uk. So
Super.
please do email me. I'm very happy to share. And in due course, I anticipate the text being available on this website. But as I said, I'm genuinely keen to engage about it. Like to feedback is 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 really welcome. It's a project that I mean, it's maybe given the nature of the time with lockdown. I mean, it's a project that I worked on in relative isolation, so it's really great to kind of show it the light of day and
Yeah.
talk about it a bit. I'll leave that slide up for and until yeah. If anyone's just writing that down, I can let me know if you want me to take that back down. But
Thanks a lot, Tom. And I think Richard said it very well. There are many rabbit holes to go down with this one. It's a never-ending story that you've embarked on. So all good luck to it, and I look forward very much to reading it all. And as I say, there's a huge amount of material there to sort of help us in our striving to become better at understanding systems and where they're going and how we can make change in the right way, positive way, which I think is a phrase you use, positive change. I like it. Thank you.
right, yeah.
Uh,
Well, yeah. I hope so. I
yeah.
hope it helps in this endeavor.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you everybody for being here today. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Tom.
Tom, very much. Thanks. Brilliant.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Bye. Thanks, Tom. Oh, thanks, Tom's gone. Right. Good, good. Thanks, everybody.